They say the devil lived in West Virginia. He walked on two legs, carried a Winchester rifle, and smoked a pipe carved from the root of a mountain laurel. But here is the thing about the devil. He rarely does his own dirty work. He has a son for that. When we talk about the American Wild West, we usually picture dusty deserts, tumbleweeds, and high noon shootouts in front of a saloon. We think of Billy the Kid or Jesse James. But while they were robbing banks in the open plains, something much darker was happening in the deep, claustrophobic forests of the Appalachians. There, the war wasn't about money. It wasn't about fame. It was about blood. And the soldiers in this war didn't wear uniforms. They wore wool coats and hid in the rhododendron thickets, waiting for hours, sometimes days, for a neighbor to walk by. For over a century, American pop culture has turned this story into a joke. Cartoons show bearded men in floppy hats shooting at each other while drinking moonshine. We laugh at the hillbillies. We dismiss them. But if you strip away the myths, if you look at the police reports and the autopsy records from the 1880s, the laughter dies in your throat. This wasn't a family squabble. This was a guerrilla war that lasted for decades. It involved governors, supreme courts, and bounty hunters. And at the center of the most violent storm stood a young man. He wasn't the leader. That was his father, the infamous Devil Anse Hatfield. But this young man was the instrument, the executioner. His name was William Anderson Hatfield. But the mountains knew him simply as Cap. Imagine a man who could shoot the head off a squirrel at 50 yards without blinking. A man who, by some accounts, had more confirmed kills than any gunslinger in Tombstone or Dodge City. But unlike those Western outlaws who sought glory, Cap moved in silence. He was a phantom. One moment he was there, standing on a ridgeline. The next, he was gone, leaving only a footprint and a dead body. The story we are about to tell is not the cartoon version. It is the story of a man bred for violence who treated the dense forests of the Tug Fork River Valley like a chessboard. It is a story of ambush, arson, and a brutality so shocking it forced the United States government to intervene. But the most twisting part of this tale isn't the killing. It's what happened after. Because usually, men like Cap Hatfield die young, face down in the dirt. Cap didn't. He did something far more terrifying. He survived, and he changed. To understand how a boy becomes a butcher and how a butcher becomes a lawyer, we first have to understand the world that made him. We have to go back to the river. The stage for this tragedy is a jagged scar on the map of America. It's called the Tug Fork. It's a tributary of the Big Sandy River, a winding, snake-like body of water that serves as the natural border between two states, West Virginia and Kentucky. In the late 1800s, this wasn't just a state line, it was an iron curtain. On the West Virginia side, you had the Hatfields. They were prosperous, powerful, and politically connected. They ran the timber business. They were the kings of Logan County. Their patriarch, Devil Anse Hatfield, was a former Confederate officer, a man who had seen the horrors of the Civil War and decided that the only law that mattered was his own. On the Kentucky side lived the McCoys. They were just as proud, but generally poorer, and arguably more bitter. Their leader, Randolph Randall McCoy, was a man consumed by a sense of injustice, brooding over every slight, real or imagined. Now, you have to understand the geography to understand the violence. These aren't open fields. These are hollers, deep, narrow valleys shut in by steep mountains. Sunlight only hits the bottom for a few hours a day. If you live in a holler, your world is small. You know everyone. You see everyone. And if you hate your neighbor, there is nowhere to go. You are trapped in a cage with your enemy. For years, the tension between these two families was like gas leaking into a closed room. There were disputes over timber rights. There were arguments over a stolen pig, a seemingly trivial event that history books love to focus on, but which was really just a spark landing on dry kindling. And then, There was the Civil War itself. The Hatfields were largely Confederates. The McCoys had fought for the Union. The war ended in 1865, but in these mountains, the peace treaty was never really signed. The resentment just went underground. It festered in the damp mountain air. It was a place where a man's property line was defined by how far his rifle could shoot. And if you crossed that line, you weren't just trespassing, you were invading. Cap Hatfield grew up breathing this air. Born in 1864, he didn't know a world without tension. He was the second son of Devil Anse. From the moment he could walk, he was taught that the McCoys across the river weren't just neighbors. They were threats. He learned to navigate the woods before he could read a book. He learned that loyalty to the bloodline was the highest virtue and betrayal was the only sin. He watched his father hold court, watched men bow to the Hatfield name, and he understood power. But power in the Tug Valley was fragile. It required constant maintenance. For a long time, the violence was contained. Fistfights, lawsuits, angry words exchanged at polling places. It was ugly, but it wasn't war. Not yet. But in August 1882, the gas that had been leaking into the room for decades finally found a flame. And it happened on a day that was supposed to be about democracy. It was August 7th, 1882, Election Day. In the mountains, this was a holiday. It meant no work, cheap whiskey, and gathering at the polling grounds on Blackberry Creek. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of men, most of them armed, milling around in the summer heat. The air smells of tobacco smoke, sweat, and corn liquor. The Hatfields are there. The McCoys are there. It is a powder keg waiting for a match, and the match was lit by a trivial argument. Some say it was about a debt. Others say it was about a fiddle. It doesn't matter. What matters is that Tolbert McCoy, a son of Randall, started exchanging sharp words with Ellison Hatfield. Ellison was Devil Anse's brother. He was a big man, a Civil War veteran, and highly respected. He wasn't looking for a fight that day, but the McCoys were. Tolbert McCoy was joined by his brothers, Farmer and Bud, 3 against 1. The shouting escalated. The crowd formed a circle. In any other place, this would have been a fist fight. A few broken noses, a handshake, and it's over. But not here. Suddenly, steel flashed in the sunlight. Knives were drawn. The festive atmosphere evaporated in a split second. The violence that followed was primal. It happened fast, a blur of motion in the mud. Ellison Hatfield didn't stand a chance. The 3 McCoy brothers swarmed him. Witnesses later described a scene of absolute frenzy. The brothers didn't just want to hurt him, they wanted to erase him. By the time the dust settled, Ellison Hatfield had been stabbed 26 times. 26. And as he fell, one of the McCoys pulled a revolver and put a bullet in his back. Silence slammed into the crowd. Ellison was somehow still alive, but he was a broken ruin of a man. The sheer brutality of the attack shocked even these hardened mountain men. The local law enforcement, terrified of what would happen next, quickly arrested the 3 McCoy brothers. They were desperate to get them to a jail in Pikeville, Kentucky, far away from the Hatfields. They knew that if Devil Anse found them, there would be no trial. But news travels fast in the hollers, faster than a wagon carrying prisoners. While the constables were moving the McCoy boys down the road, hoping to outrun the vengeance, a shadow fell over them. Devil Anse had heard, and he wasn't alone. He rode out with a posse of over 20 men. Among them, riding hard, was his son Cap. They intercepted the lawmen near the river. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a takeover. The Hatfields, armed to the teeth, simply took the prisoners. They didn't shoot them. Not yet. Devil Anse looked at the 3 brothers, Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud, and issued a chilling decree. He said they would wait. They would wait to see if Ellison lived. If Ellison survived his wounds, the McCoys would be handed back to the law. But if Ellison died, the boys would belong to the Hatfields. For 2 days, time stood still. The Hatfields held the three McCoy brothers captive in an old schoolhouse on the West Virginia side of the river. They fed them. They let them pray. But outside, the guards watched the horizon, waiting for news from Ellison's bedside. Cap Hatfield was there, watching the prisoners. He was 18 years old enough to be a man, young enough to still be molded. He watched his uncles and cousins cleaning their rifles. He saw the grim determination on his father's face. He was learning a lesson that no school could teach. Law is just a word. Power is a loaded gun. On August 9th, the news arrived. Ellison Hatfield was dead. The atmosphere in the schoolhouse shifted instantly. The waiting was over. The promise had been made, and now it had to be kept. It was night. Rain had begun to fall, a steady, miserable drizzle that turned the dirt roads to slick mud. The Hatfields marched the three McCoy brothers out into the darkness. They crossed the river back into Kentucky. Why Kentucky? Because Devil Anse wanted to send a message. He was bringing the bodies back to their own soil. Or perhaps, in his twisted logic, he didn't want their blood staining West Virginia ground. They stopped in a small clearing known as the Pawpaw Bushes. The river rushed nearby, swollen with rain. The brothers were tied to the pawpaw trees. Tolbert, Farmer, Bud. Bud was the youngest. He was barely an adult. The terror in that clearing must have been palpable. The smell of wet leaves, the sound of the river, and the clicking of hammers being cocked. Devil Anse didn't do it himself. That wasn't the way. This was a communal execution, a firing squad. Everyone had to be part of it. Everyone had to have blood on their hands so no one could turn on the others later. Cap raised his rifle. This moment is pivotal. Until now, Cap was a son, a farmhand, a rough-and-tumble boy. When he pulled that trigger, he crossed a line he could never step back over. The command was given. The night erupted in a volley of gunfire. It wasn't clean. It wasn't quick. The Hatfields reloaded and fired again. Dozens of bullets tore through the soft wood of the pawpaw trees and the bodies of the brothers. It was overkill. It was rage manifest in lead. When the smoke cleared, the silence returned, heavier than before. The three McCoys hung limp against the trees, perforated and broken. The Hatfields turned and walked away, back across the river, back into the mist. They left the bodies for the families to find. They believed justice had been served. An eye for an eye, 3 lives for 1. But they were wrong. They hadn't ended the dispute. They had just poured gasoline on a fire that would burn for the next decade. And in the darkness of that night, as the smell of gunpowder clung to his coat, Cap Hatfield had changed. He had looked death in the face and hadn't blinked. The phantom of the tug fork was born. Who was this young man walking away from the pawpaw trees? William Anderson Hatfield was a paradox. Physically, he was intimidating, though not a giant like his uncle Ellison. He had a strong build, broad shoulders, and a face that seemed carved out of granite. But it was his eyes that people remembered. Folks in the valley said he had a wall eye or a bad eye, one eye that wandered or looked different. In local folklore, this was often a sign of a cursed soul, or at least a volatile one. When Cap looked at you, you weren't quite sure where he was looking, which only added to the unease. But behind those eyes was a sharp, calculating intelligence. Most of the men involved in the feud were brawlers. They acted on impulse, fueled by whiskey and temper. Cap was different. He was a tactician. He didn't drink much. He didn't boast in the taverns. He treated violence like a trade. His relationship with his father, Devil Anse, was complex. Devil Anse was the charismatic leader, the general of the clan. He made the speeches. He negotiated the politics. But Cap was his lieutenant, his enforcer. If Devil Anse was the brain, Cap was the trigger finger. There is a terrifying intimacy in that dynamic. A father grooming his son not to take over the family farm, but to be his bodyguard and assassin. Cap revered his father. He absorbed his father's paranoia. He believed, truly believed, that the Hatfields were the victims, constantly under siege by the McCoys and the Kentucky government. While his father gave the orders, Cap was the one checking the windage on the sites. He became a master of the ambush. He knew every cave, every deer trail, every ridge in the Tug Valley. He could disappear into the woods for days, living off the land, watching, waiting. He was the original guerrilla fighter of the Appalachians, and rumors began to swirl. If a McCoy horse was shot in the night, Cap did it. If a barn burned down, must have been Cap. He became the boogeyman of Pike County. But for 5 long years after the Paw Tree executions, the war went cold. It was a stalemate. The McCoys were grieving and disorganized. The Hatfields were secure in their West Virginia fortress. Cap got married. He had children. For a moment it looked like he might just settle down and become a regular mountain man. He worked the timber. He farmed. But beneath the surface, the legal wheels were turning. The mother of the murdered boys, Sarah McCoy, never forgot. And Randall McCoy never forgave. They were petitioning the governor of Kentucky. They were hiring lawyers. They realized they couldn't beat the Hatfields with bullets. Not yet. They needed the law. And in 1887, a new player entered the game. A man who would turn Cap's world upside down. The quiet years were over. The bounty hunters were coming. The man who changed everything wasn't a McCoy. His name was Perry Cline. Cline was a lawyer, a politician, and a man with a personal grudge against Devil Anse Hatfield over a timberland dispute years prior. He was smart, connected, and he saw an opportunity. He convinced the governor of Kentucky to revive the indictments for the murder of the 3 McCoy brothers. Those indictments had been gathering dust for 5 years. Suddenly, they were active again, and they had names on them. Top of the list, Devil Anse Hatfield. Second on the list, Cap Hatfield. But a piece of paper is useless without someone to enforce it. The sheriff of West Virginia wasn't going to arrest the Hatfields. They were the power in West Virginia. So, Kentucky authorized rewards for their capture. This transformed the feud. It wasn't just about family honor anymore. It was about money. Enter Bad Frank Phillips. If Cap Hatfield was the devil's executioner, Frank Phillips was the Grim Reaper with a badge. He was a deputy sheriff, but that title was loose. In reality, he was a tough, ruthless gunman who hated the Hatfields as much as the McCoys did. Phillips began leading raids across the border into West Virginia. These weren't polite knocks on the door. These were incursions. He and his posse would ride in, kick down doors, drag Hatfields out of their beds, and haul them back to Kentucky jails. The psychological impact on Cap and his father was immense. For the first time, they weren't the hunters. They were the prey. Imagine the paranoia. Every stranger on the road could be a bounty hunter. Every rustle in the leaves could be Frank Phillips. Cap stopped sleeping in his own house. He began sleeping in the woods, in caves, or in forts, cabins reinforced with logs thick enough to stop a bullet. The Tug Valley became a militarized zone. The Hatfields set up a network of spies and lookouts. Signals echoed through the hollers, whistles, bird calls, gunshots, warning of approaching riders. The pressure cooker was screaming. Devil Anse saw his clan being picked off one by one. His brother, his cousins, they were disappearing into Kentucky jails. He knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. And for Cap, they were cornered animals. And a cornered animal is the most dangerous thing on earth. In late 1887, the Hatfields held a war council. The mood was grim. They couldn't keep running. They couldn't keep hiding. If the McCoys wanted a war using the courts, the Hatfields would end it using the only language they truly understood. They decided to strike at the heart of the problem. They believed that if they could just eliminate the witnesses, the people who could testify against them for the Paw Tree murders, the legal case would collapse. Who were the key witnesses? The McCoy family themselves. Randall McCoy, his wife, his children. The target was set. The plan was drawn. And Cap Hatfield checked his Winchester. He was about to lead a raid that would go down in history as one of the most savage acts on American soil. To understand the horror of what happened next, you have to understand the logic. To us, it looks like madness. To them, it was a tactical necessity. It was December 1887. The mountains were buried under snow. The air was sharp enough to freeze your breath in your lungs. In the Hatfield stronghold, the inner circle gathered. Devil Anse, Cap, and a trusted, slightly unhinged associate named Jim Vance, Cap's uncle. Vance was older, meaner, and had a reputation for extreme violence that even some Hatfields found unsettling. The logic was simple. The Kentucky courts needed witnesses to convict them of the 1882 killings. If there are no witnesses, there is no trial. If there is no trial, there is no hanging. The witnesses lived in one cabin, Randall McCoy's cabin. It wasn't a crime of passion anymore. It was a hit, a calculated, premeditated extermination. They didn't just want to kill Randall. They wanted to send a message so terrifying that no bounty hunter would ever dare cross the Tug River again. Cap was 23 years old now. He was in his prime. He wasn't just following orders blindly. He was an active participant in the planning. He knew the terrain. He knew the approach. They gathered a group of about 9 men, a mix of family members and loyalists. They included a young man named Ellison Mounts, who was rumored to be the illegitimate son of the murdered Ellison Hatfield. He was not particularly bright, easily manipulated, and eager to please Cap and Vance. He would play a tragic role in this drama. The plan was specific: surround the cabin under the cover of darkness. Demand Randall McCoy's surrender. If he didn't, burn it down. Think about that. Burn it down. They knew there were women and children inside. They knew Randall's wife Sarah was there. They knew his young daughters and sons were there, and they didn't care. This is the moment where any sympathy for the feud as a romantic struggle evaporates. This wasn't defending your home. This was a death squad. They checked their weapons: Winchesters, revolvers, shotguns. They packed torches and kerosene. As the sun set on New Year's Day, 1888, the group set out. They moved like ghosts through the frozen forest. No talking, no smoking, just the crunch of snow under boots and the rhythmic breathing of men marching toward murder. Cap walked near the front. His face was hidden by a slouch hat, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He was walking toward the defining moment of his life, the moment that would earn him the title, the Butcher. Across the river, the McCoy family was settling in for the night. They had no idea that the devil was coming for dinner. January 1st, 1888. Midnight. The cold was absolute. A cold so deep it felt like the world had died, and this was its ghost. The snow on the ground was a pale blue sheet under the moon, reflecting a dead light. Imagine the silence. It's a special kind of quiet that only happens in a deep freeze, when the very air seems to crackle. The only sounds were the soft crunch of 9 sets of boots on the snow and the ghostly white plumes of their breath. The McCoy cabin appeared in a clearing. It was a dark, solid shape against the snow, with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. A single point of warmth in a frozen universe. A point they had come to extinguish. Cap moved with the quiet confidence of a predator. He was the field commander. With hand signals, he directed his men, 2 to the back, 2 to the side. He, Vance, and the others would take the front. They moved like wolves, using the trees and the long shadows for cover, closing the circle. Inside that cabin, the McCoys were asleep. Randall and his wife Sarah, their children. They were wrapped in blankets, dreaming, unaware of the ring of steel that was tightening around their home. The only warning came from the family dogs, who began to bark frantically at the unseen threat in the woods. Inside, one of the McCoy children, awakened by the barking, might have thought it was a fox or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. But outside, Cap was in position. He could see the warm glow of embers through the single window. He could feel the cold stock of his Winchester against his cheek. He waited. He let the silence stretch, letting the terror build in the darkness. This wasn't a fight. It was a siege. Every man knew his role. Every man knew the plan. Then, a voice boomed out of the darkness. It was Jim Vance. "Randall McCoy, we have you surrounded. Come out and surrender." A light flickered on inside the cabin. A shadow moved past the window. The barking of the dogs turned into a high-pitched, desperate frenzy. Then, from inside the cabin, a reply. The roar of a shotgun blast shattering the night. The first shot of the battle wasn't fired by a Hatfield. It was fired by a desperate man defending his home. And in that moment, all hell broke loose. The night exploded into a hailstorm of lead. Muzzle flashes from the woods stabbed the darkness as the Hatfields opened fire from all sides. Inside, the McCoys were trapped. The wooden walls of the cabin offered some protection, but they were taking fire from every direction. Randall and his son Calvin returned fire, their shotgun blasts a defiant roar against the crack of the Winchesters. For a time, it was a stalemate. The Hatfields couldn't get in, and the McCoys couldn't get out. But Cap and Jim Vance had planned for this. They had brought the fire. Under covering fire, one of the raiders rushed the cabin, throwing a torch onto the dry, shingled roof. It caught instantly. Then another torch hit the side wall. The dry timber, seasoned by decades of winter cold and summer heat, went up like a matchbox. Imagine the choice they had inside: stay and be shot, or run out and be shot. Now, a third option was added: stay and burn. The smoke was the first enemy. Thick, black and choking, it filled the small cabin, turning the air to poison. The heat became unbearable. The wood of the walls began to groan and pop. In the chaos, Hatfield-McCoy, one of Randall's adult daughters, made a fatal decision. Desperate for air, or perhaps believing the attackers would spare a woman, she ran to the kitchen door and threw it open. A single shot cracked louder than the rest. Hatfield stumbled back into the doorway and collapsed onto the floor. Seeing her daughter fall, Sarah McCoy screamed. It was a sound that cut through the gunfire, a sound of pure, primal grief. She rushed to her daughter's side. Then, according to testimony, she saw Cap Hatfield standing in the doorway. She screamed at him, "They've killed my daughter." What happened next is a testament to the savagery of the night. One of the raiders, some say it was Cap himself, didn't shoot. He swung his rifle like a club. He brought the butt of it down hard on Sarah McCoy's head, and she collapsed, unconscious, next to the body of her daughter. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was an extermination. With the cabin now an inferno, Randall McCoy knew it was over. He made a desperate run for his life. He burst out the back, into the freezing darkness of his cornfield, and scrambled away as bullets whizzed past his head in the night. He didn't stop running. Another of Randall's sons, Calvin, was also shot and killed as he tried to escape the flames. The raid was over in less than an hour. The Hatfields melted back into the woods, their work done. They left behind a scene from a nightmare. The McCoy cabin was a roaring funeral pyre against the snow. Inside were the bodies of a son and a daughter. Outside lay a mother, beaten and left for dead. The raiders retreated across the river, believing they had finally broken the McCoys. They believed they had won. But the light from that fire was seen for miles, and it would soon shine a spotlight on their little war that would bring the wrath of a nation down upon them. The New Year's massacre was not a secret kept by the mountains. The story of the burning cabin and the murdered family traveled down the telegraph wires, and it landed on the front pages of newspapers in a country that was suddenly fascinated and horrified. Imagine opening your morning paper in New York City or Chicago in January of 1888. You read about stock prices, politics, and then you see it. A headline about a vendetta in the mountains, war on the Tug Fork, savage clans in a fight to the death. Journalists, smelling a sensational story, descended on the region. They painted a picture of a primitive, lawless land stuck in a time warp. They called the Hatfields and McCoys American Montagues and Capulets, but with rifles instead of rapiers. This wasn't a local crime story anymore. It was a national scandal. The political pressure became immense. The governor of Kentucky, Simon Bolivar Buckner, was outraged. He saw the raid as an act of invasion by a foreign power. He accused West Virginia of harboring a nest of terrorists. In return, the governor of West Virginia, E. Willis Wilson, fired back. He accused Kentucky's bad Frank Phillips and his posses of being illegal invaders, kidnapping West Virginia citizens without due process. The two states were on the brink of calling out their militias. It was a constitutional crisis. Could one state legally send armed men into another to capture its citizens? The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And at the center of this firestorm, one name was printed again and again: William Anderson Cap Hatfield. He was no longer just a ghost in the West Virginia woods. He was now a household name. He was the villain in a national drama. His walleye was described in lurid detail. His supposed kill count was exaggerated. He became the living embodiment of the savage mountaineer that the rest of America both feared and, in a strange way, was fascinated by. The bounty on his head skyrocketed. He was now public enemy number one. For Devil Anse, this was a disaster. He was a politician. He understood power. And he knew that the power of the press and the United States government was something his clan could not fight. But for Cap, it simply raised the stakes. The world was now watching. He couldn't surrender. To surrender meant a Kentucky jail and a Kentucky rope. His only option was to fight. Back in Kentucky, Frank Phillips was given a blank check. The political embarrassment was so great that he was told to end this once and for all. Get the men responsible for the New Year's massacre, get Jim Vance, and most of all, get Cap Hatfield. Phillips gathered the largest posse yet. He armed them with the best rifles money could buy. This wasn't going to be another stealth raid. This was an invasion force. They crossed the Tug Fork, not in the dead of night, but in broad daylight. They were coming for a reckoning. The war came to the Hatfields on January 19, 1888. Frank Phillips and his posse of nearly 30 men were not hunting for rumors. They had a specific target list, and the first name on it was Jim Vance. They tracked him to his cabin. The fight was short and brutal. Vance, the old warrior, was cut down in a hail of bullets. Phillips had claimed his first major prize. The sound of that sustained gunfire echoed through the frozen valleys. For Cap Hatfield, hiding miles away, it was a death knell. He knew exactly what it meant. They had gotten Vance, and he was next. But Cap didn't run. Not yet. He gathered what men he could, his brother Johnsy, a few cousins and loyalists, and prepared to make a stand. He wasn't going to let them pick his family off one by one in their homes. He would meet them in the field. He chose his ground carefully, a place called Grapevine Creek. It was perfect defensive terrain. He positioned his men on a ridge overlooking the path that Phillips's posse would have to take. The creek itself acted as a natural moat, and the trees provided excellent cover. He funneled the attackers into a kill zone. It was a classic ambush. When Phillips and his men rode into the valley, they were confident, maybe even arrogant, after their easy victory over Vance. They rode straight into the trap. Cap gave the signal. The ridgeline exploded with fire. The posse was caught completely in the open. Men dove for cover behind rocks and trees. Horses screamed and bolted. For a few critical minutes, the Hatfields had complete superiority. They poured a relentless fire down on the pinned lawmen. But Frank Phillips was not an easy man to kill. He rallied his men. They had superior numbers and a grim determination. The skirmish turned into a full-blown battle that raged for hours. Bullets splintered the trees. Ricochets whined through the cold air. Men shouted orders and curses that were swallowed by the constant roar of the rifles. Cap was in his element. He moved from position to position, directing fire, calling out targets. He was a commander leading his troops in the heart of combat, but he was outmanned and outgunned. Slowly, methodically, Phillips's men began to advance, using flanking maneuvers to get around the Hatfield position. Cap realized the line was about to break. If they stayed, they would be surrounded and annihilated. He made the call: retreat. It became a running gun battle. The Hatfields would fall back 50 yards, take cover, and lay down fire while the others retreated past them. Cap was one of the last to pull back, his Winchester providing cover for his fleeing kinsmen. But the fight was lost. By the time the shooting stopped, the Hatfield clan as a fighting force was shattered. Several of their men were captured. Their ammunition was spent. Their will was broken. The Battle of Grapevine Creek was over. The Hatfield war machine was smashed, and Cap Hatfield vanished. He melted into the deep woods he knew better than any man alive, leaving the victorious posse standing on the empty battlefield. He had escaped, but he had lost everything else. He was now alone, a king without a kingdom, hunted by the law and by the ghosts of the men he had killed. After Grapevine Creek, the law swept through the Tug Valley. They arrested Devil Anse's sons, his nephews, and his supporters. The Hatfield Empire crumbled in a matter of weeks. The only major player still at large was Cap. He became a ghost, a legend whispered around campfires. For months, Cap lived like a wild animal. He slept in caves and abandoned coal mines. He drank from streams and hunted for his food with traps and snares, rarely daring to fire his rifle for fear the sound would give him away. He was a master of evasion. He knew the land so well that he could travel for miles without ever leaving a footprint on a trail. He used the creeks to hide his tracks and the dense thickets of rhododendron to disappear in plain sight. The posses hunting him were relentless. They brought in trackers and dogs. They offered bigger and bigger rewards. But Cap was always one step ahead. He was a shadow they could never quite catch. Stories of his cunning became local folklore. One tale claims he walked right into a town where a posse was headquartered. He had shaved his beard, wore different clothes, and adopted a limp. He walked right past the men hunting him, and they tipped their hats, never knowing death just brushed their shoulders. Another story says he was cornered in a cabin. The posse surrounded it, shouting for his surrender. Instead of shooting his way out, Cap waited until dark, then slipped out a loose floorboard and crawled on his belly for 100 yards through a muddy pigsty to get away. These stories might be exaggerated, but they speak to a core truth. Cap was not just a brute, he was a survivor. His intelligence was as sharp as his aim. But what was the psychological toll of this existence? Imagine the profound loneliness. His family was gone, either in jail or in hiding. He was cut off from everyone he had ever known. He was constantly cold, constantly hungry, and constantly looking over his shoulder. His world shrank to the immediate essentials: shelter, food, and the next sunrise. But even a ghost can't run forever. The world was changing around him. His father, Devil Anse, seeing his family destroyed, was forced to negotiate a kind of peace. He couldn't protect his son anymore. The old way of life was over. The feud was ending not with a bang, but with the slow, grinding machinery of the law. And the law was about to make its final, most dramatic statement. The men captured after the battle were being put on trial, and one of them was destined for the gallows. While Cap was a ghost in the mountains, his family members were ghosts in a courtroom. The trials of the captured Hatfields began in Pikeville, Kentucky. Imagine these men, who had only ever known the unwritten laws of the Hollows, suddenly thrust into the world of judges, juries, and lawyers. They were dressed in ill-fitting suits, looking bewildered and trapped under the gaslights of the courthouse. The prosecution needed a conviction for the New Year's massacre, and they found their perfect target in Ellison Cotton Top Mounts. Cotton Top was an outcast. He was known to be slow, simple-minded, and desperate for the approval of men like Cap and Jim Vance. He was the weak link. Under interrogation, he confessed. He claimed that he was the one who fired the shot that killed Hatfield-McCoy. Whether he actually did it, or if he was just saying what the lawmen wanted to hear, or if he was covering for Cap, We will never know. But his confession was a death sentence. The jury found him guilty of murder. The judge donned a black cap and sentenced him to hang by the neck until dead. The hanging was scheduled for February 18th, 1890. It was to be a public spectacle, the final chapter of the great American feud. Thousands of people flocked to Pikeville to witness it. They built a gallows in the center of town. It was a message from the state of Kentucky to the mountains of West Virginia. The law has a longer reach than any rifle. On the day of the execution, Cotton Top Mounts stood on the platform. He looked out at the sea of faces. His last words were reportedly, "The Hatfields made me do it." Then the black hood was pulled over his head. The noose was tightened. The chaplain said a final prayer, and the trapdoor sprang open. In that moment, as the rope went taut, the Hatfield-McCoy feud officially died. It had started with a knife fight and ended with a state-sanctioned execution. Somewhere in the woods, the news reached Cap Hatfield. He learned that one of his own men had been hanged by the law he so despised. And in that news, Cap, the master tactician, saw the future. He understood a fundamental shift in the nature of power. For his entire life, power came from the barrel of a gun. It was about loyalty, blood, and the willingness to kill. But the gun couldn't save Cotton Top. The clan couldn't save him. A piece of paper, a warrant, a verdict, a death sentence had proven to be more powerful than a whole army of mountain men. The game had changed. The rules were different now. And if he wanted to survive, he couldn't keep playing the old way. He had to learn the new rules. Running and hiding was a dead end. Fighting was suicide. Surrender meant the same rope that had strangled Ellison Mounts. So Cap Hatfield, the ghost of the Tugfork, made a decision. It was a choice so unexpected, so completely out of character, that it shocked his friends and enemies alike. He decided to come in from the cold, but not in the way anyone expected. In the early 1890s, the man who was once the most wanted fugitive in 2 states walked out of the woods. He didn't turn himself into the law in Kentucky. He turned himself into the authorities in his home state of West Virginia. And a strange thing happened. Nothing. The political winds had shifted. The feud was over. West Virginia was tired of the bad press. They saw no benefit in prosecuting one of their own to satisfy Kentucky. They quietly granted Cap a pardon for his past crimes. He was, for the first time in his adult life, a free man. Most people expected him to fade into obscurity, a quiet life of farming, maybe a little timber work. But Cap Hatfield was not built for a quiet life. He had seen firsthand the power of the law. He had seen how it could reach across state lines and put a rope around a man's neck. And instead of hating it, he became fascinated by it. He decided that if he couldn't beat the law, he would join it. This man, who was barely literate for much of the feud, began to study. He taught himself to read fluently, not just dime novels, but dense, complex legal texts. He devoured books on jurisprudence, on precedents, on courtroom procedure. Imagine the scene. Cap Hatfield, the butcher of the Tugfork, sitting by an oil lamp late into the night, his calloused fingers tracing the words in a law book. He passed the bar exam. Let that sink in. William Anderson. Cap Hatfield, the leader of the New Year's Massacre, became a practicing attorney. His new battlefield was the courtroom. His new weapons were objections and cross-examinations. He opened a law office in Logan, West Virginia, and people hired him. Who wouldn't want the most famously ruthless man in the state arguing on their behalf? The irony was staggering. He defended men accused of the same kinds of crimes he had once committed. He argued about property lines, the same disputes that had started the feud. But the transformation didn't stop there. He went even further. Cap Hatfield, the man who had shot at lawmen, who had spent years as a fugitive, became a deputy sheriff of Logan County. He now wore the badge. He carried a gun not as an outlaw, but as an enforcer of the very system he once fought. He arrested moonshiners. He broke up fights. He was, by all accounts, a good and effective lawman. The ultimate poacher had turned gamekeeper. What does this tell us about him? Was it a genuine change of heart? A desire for redemption? Or was it the ultimate act of a pragmatist? A man who simply adapted to a new form of power? Perhaps he realized that in the 20th century, a man with a law book was more powerful than a man with a rifle. He became a pillar of the community, a respected, if still feared, figure. People would point to him on the street and whisper, "That's Cap Hatfield." But now, they weren't talking about a killer. They were talking about the law. He had successfully rewritten his own story. But no matter how many suits he wore or how many cases he won, the mountains have a long memory, and the ghosts of the tug fork were not done with him yet. As the years passed, Cap Hatfield grew into a thick-set, formidable old man. The walleye was still there, a constant reminder of the wild youth he had left behind. He was a man of property, a family man, a fixture in the town of Logan. But the old warrior never truly went away. Locals told stories of his quiet intensity. He rarely spoke of the feud, but he never let his guard down. Even in his office, wearing a suit and tie, a loaded revolver was never far from his hand. It was usually in a desk drawer, just an arm's length away. A lifetime of paranoia is a hard habit to break. He lived to see the world change in ways he could never have imagined. He saw the arrival of automobiles, the telephone, the dawn of a new century. The wild, lawless world that had forged him was gone, replaced by pavement and power lines. His father, Devil Anse, found a different kind of peace. In his old age, he was baptized in a river by a traveling preacher, renouncing his violent past and embracing Christianity. He died a peaceful death in his own bed in 1921. Cap's end was different. It was stranger, more unsettling. In the late 1920s, his health began to fail. He started experiencing severe headaches and erratic behavior. The man who had been a model of cold, calculating control began to lose that control. Some say he became paranoid again, seeing old enemies in every shadow. Others described fits of rage that were reminiscent of his younger days. The violence that he had so carefully contained for decades was bubbling back to the surface. In 1930, he was taken to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, one of the best medical facilities in the country. The doctors there discovered the cause of his decline. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't a curse from the McCoys. It was a brain tumor. The great gunman, the cunning survivalist, the sharp-witted lawyer, was being brought down by a silent, invisible enemy growing inside his own skull. William Anderson. Cap Hatfield died in that hospital bed on August 22, 1930. He was 66 years old. The man everyone expected to die in a blaze of glory with a gun in his hand died quietly under white sheets, hundreds of miles from the river that had defined his life. There was no final shootout, no dramatic last stand, just the slow, inevitable surrender to biology. It's a strange, anticlimactic end to such a violent story. Or is it? Perhaps it's the most fitting end of all. In the end, the butcher of the tug fork wasn't claimed by a bullet or a rope, the tools of his old world. He was claimed by a disease, a modern affliction diagnosed by modern science. The new world he had worked so hard to join finally caught up with him in its own quiet, clinical way. So who was William Anderson Cap Hatfield? Was he a cold-blooded killer, a monster who burned people in their homes and clubbed a grieving mother with the butt of his rifle? Or was he a loyal son, a soldier in a brutal, forgotten war, doing what he believed was necessary to protect his family in a land where the law was a suggestion, not a guarantee? The truth is, he was probably both. Cap Hatfield was a product of a specific time and a specific place, a place of intense loyalty and even more intense hatred. He was born into a war he didn't start, and he was taught from childhood that the only justice you could rely on was the justice you made for yourself. He was the perfect weapon for that world. His story is more than just the tale of one man. It's a window into the dark, violent heart of a nation still healing from a civil war. It reminds us that the Wild West wasn't just in the deserts of Arizona. It was in the deep, shaded hollows of Appalachia, where family lines were battle lines, and a man's last name could be a death sentence. And yet, the most astonishing part of his life is not the killing. It's the second act, the transformation from guerrilla fighter to country lawyer. The fact that he was able to put down the rifle and pick up a law book and be successful at both is a deeply American story. It speaks to our national belief in reinvention, the idea that you can leave your past behind, that you can be born again, not through religion, but through sheer force of will. But can you ever truly wash that much blood off your hands? Did the suit and the tie and the legal arguments ever quiet the ghosts of New Year's night? Did he ever, in the quiet moments before sleep, see the face of Hatfield-McCoy in the doorway? We will never know. He took those secrets with him. What he left behind is a legacy of brutal contradiction, a man of violence who died of a disease, a man who defied the law who became the law, a ghost of the 19th century who learned to survive in the 20th. He proved that in America you can rewrite your story, but you can never wash the ink off your hands.